Welcome to the Reflections podcast. I'm Ken Boa.
And I'm Stuart McAllister.
Good to be with you, Stuart. And we were going to be talking, as we described in our last time together, about time and eternity. What comes to your mind as you would like to pursue that as in our conversation?
Oh, I think several things, Ken. I think, one of the things at the current time is how immediacy has so drowned out. I've been very taken by this fact that life has accelerated and space has shrunk. And so all of life has become invaded. And I think for Christians who think about the transcendent, who want to think about the transcendent, there's very little time, there's very little space. So if one of the core attributes of living as a Christian is to walk in the eternal, to have a sense of its proportion, its presence.
Yes.
But if life itself stops that, I'm intrigued of how we actually then live in this moment.
How do we manifest then eternal values in this temporal arena in such a way that everything that we do really will have some meaning, even though the world might construe it as being something small or trivial? The Word invites us to see that everything we do should count.
I mean, I don't want to hark back to all these times, but I can remember, one of the times when I was arrested, and being the hours of waiting in silence. And a friend of mine, Al Whittinghill, used to say, "You don't know that God is all you need till God is all you have." And that was absolutely true. I remember being in these, Bible taken away, freedom taken away, locked up in a prison situation. And also, just you're alone. So the only thing you have is your thoughts, your memories, and your prayer life between God. But it's not a question, do I believe in some kind of emotional senses? You're crying out for God's presence in terms of his comfort.
Yes.
But you're also crying out for, how should I then live?
Yes.
Now,
how does this fit with the calling? Why did you go there to be in prison? So it's almost like Paul wandering at Caesarea Philippi. He's spending 2 years there waiting to figure out what's going to happen. And enough is enough. And finally he realizes he's got no choice. He's got to appeal to Caesar. Then he gets another 2 more years.
Right.
So what kind of thing is this, the apostle to the Gentiles? It doesn't seem the way it would be working. His sphere of influence has gotten very mighty small. So it's a question then of recalibrating my circumstances in light of God's presence and calling in my life, and
but that challenge, the human challenge, and you and I have talked about this particularly. I mean, then the COVID year, and then some of the meltdowns that we had experienced from the collapse of our organization, and some of the history and pain involved with that in my prior experience. But God's redirects that come to us, but you need this perspective that God is still in control.
Yes. That
when life goes sideways, as it often does, because I want an ordered, planned world. I want to be in control. I'm a rational man, and I want to be in control of my destiny. And everything about life tells me that. Everything ideally says that, but actually none of life goes that way.
No, life is contrary to our expectations. We have our desires, but we're not God. And we would like to be little gods and so forth, but at the end of the day, we can't control anything. And so having a realistic assessment of this, but the question of meaning comes to mind then. Suppose the thing is you're in a place that's too small, you're narrow, you're confined, you're in solitary confinement, let's say. What possible utility could that have? Or this project I was working on doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And how do I contextualize it? We all have blocked goals and desires, don't we?
And how, if C.S. Lewis's idea that God is the great iconoclast, one of the things I learned in this, Ken, for me, and I mean, I continue to learn, and apparently I'm going to do so until I go home to see the King face to face, is that I have my theology of God locks into a particular thing, and I think I've got God figured out. I think I've got the Christian life figured out. I think I've got prayer and Bible study and apologetics figured out. And God always brings us to a place where experience, life, a person, an argument, something comes along and pow. And then as I'm shattered or discouraged or disillusioned or searching, eventually it comes to a place where you realize there's another answer, and God but again, you tend to freeze frame that, okay, now my God's a little bit bigger, but it's still not God, it's just my conception.
So it reveals to us as well that our view of our own well-being is dependent upon our own narratives that we invent, and rather than submitting to the call to which God is in fact inviting us to pursue, though it would go in a way contrary to my desires. I then realized, no, I have to submit to this. If I do whatever I can do as unto him and then let loose of the ownership, because we've often said this, you have to be faithful to the process, but you have to let loose of the ownership of the outcome. I can't control the outcome. So then I find myself in a confined space or in a place where I don't want it to be. It's more limiting. How do I look at that? Does everything matter is the question.
Yeah, well, I remember, I think we were talking some weeks ago together about Philip Reef's statement, the moral life begins with renunciation.
Yes.
The therapeutic life begins with the renunciation of renunciation. And that those two, so that the idea of renunciation, that I have to surrender and dying to self is so much a part now, but I can't do that as a Christian unless the eternal is real, unless the eternal manages time, unless the eternal governs, invades, and is actually seen, so that my earthly sojourn, my journey here, my pilgrimage, fraught with pressures and pains and lots of joys and pleasures too, has purpose. But that purpose comes from that the eternal, that there is a being, there is a God who loves me.
Yes.
And who has a plan for me, not in the simplest, we say God loves me, is a wonderful plan for his life, but that is true, isn't it?
Yeah.
He does.
Well, we are on a quest for meaning, and the answer is, where did I come from? Why am I here? Who am I? Where am I going? Those are fundamental questions, and only the scriptures, I think, provide adequate solutions to them. But at the end, I have to look at the circumstances this very day. It's not what I wanted it to be. This thing happened over here, or that thing happened over there. So what do I have to do? How do I respond to that situation? And I think we have anger. That's one approach.
Well, but I think, isn't it? I mean, again, that's what I'm watching people behave, and I'm listening, and I think that's so that we get primed, because if we believe, if the narrative we're living in, the worldly narrative, is that I am rational man in control of my destiny, then always having a goal, always having a solution, always having a technique, always having a plan, always having something, I can figure this out and so I can fix it. Like Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino. I fix things, that's what I do.
I fix things,
right? But the fact is, it's not that we can't fix some things, we are allowed to, and God gives us a scope of influence. But in all the big things, we're getting the story wrong.
That's exactly, At the end of the day, we're not to fix things, we're to submit things. And so as we submit our view of what our best interests look like and ask God to, let me glorify you in everything, then suddenly everything has a dignity and an importance. In fact, there's a poem I'd like us to chat through. There's 5 stanzas, and it would be a great illustration of the things that we've discussed. And you and I have talked about George Herbert a lot, and we've talked about the elixir, and it has 5 stanzas. And I think it'd be an interesting way of being an exemplar of this very thing. So let's just look at first. They're short little stanzas. The first one: teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as for thee. Let's stop with that first stanza. Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as for thee. Now what he's doing is inviting me to learn to see God in the good and in the bad, and in the circumstances, because he's bigger than the engineerings of men. And
that takes me back also to those where you were talking about the 3 questions in the Gospel of John, and that, like the first one, what do you seek?
What do you seek?
So when you ask that question, teach me, my God, in all things to see. I think that's what suffering, or that's what disappointment does. Because suffering, disappointment, sometimes beauty does that as well, like Lewis tells us, but it forces us to question. But suffering is that megaphone which makes me say, and often all I see is the darkness, I see the pain, but usually the resolution of that is when I see God in the suffering.
Yes, see him in the pain or through the suffering. Yeah. So it becomes actually something that becomes translucent. You begin to see through it. There's a kind of a luminous dynamic. If I welcome his presence into this mundane, routine, and ordinary, it turns the ordinary into the extraordinary.
But you're not saying like in some kind of Freudian cycle, teach me that. In other words, the poet is not encouraging to inject something that is not there in order to control the pain.
That's right.
He's suggesting we need to see something that is there.
Right. not a
in the
fictional narrative that's useful to placate and become a kind of a bromide that helps us get through life, but rather, no, the affirmation that he is there and that he can do anything. And so in all things thee to see. And then the interesting thing that the poet says, and what I do in anything, to do it as for thee. Now what he's doing is now he's saying, not only are you there, but everything that I touch, my hands touch, can be done as to him, as for thy sake, rather than for my sake, it can be done. So then the person for whom I'm doing it will affect the way in which I do it as well.
So
it's a perspective.
He's not saying it's all about me.
No, he's saying it's about God, and it's about my privilege to see him in all things, and then to do it as an offering. Everything becomes an offering if it's done with excellence.
And where does it go on? What's the next?
So he goes on. So he then describes in the second stanza, not rudely as a beast to run into an action. In other words, not to do it instinctually, you see.
Like just out of habit.
Yeah, but still to make thee prepossessed and give it his perfection. And so what he's saying there is to say, I don't want to just do that as a kind of a gut reaction to things. I want to do it intentionally. And to make you prepossessed is, so the choice then is to give it his perfection by inviting him into the fray, into the situation, welcoming him into the circumstances in which I find myself. Not just instinctually, but intentionally.
But again, Herbert was writing at a time and out of a kind of depth of a Christian
Yes, he
perspective
was.
that is largely uncommon today.
Very
and
uncommon.
when I say uncommon, not around the world, but particularly in Western evangelicalism, because we are a people of immediacy, we're a people of urgency. We want cool, we want relevant, we want fast, we want with it, we want fun. We want God to be hip, and this kind of stuff seems a bit odd.
It's an eternal perspective rather than a temporal perspective. And so to have an eternal perspective in a temporal arena makes all the difference in the world. In fact, the next stanza, it really illustrates this beautifully, because he says, a man who looks on glass, on it may stay his eye. In other words, he looks at the window. He can either look at the window and he sees the cobwebs and sees the imperfections, or he can look through the window. Or if he chooses, through it pass, and then the heavens espy. So it's a brilliant way of putting it then. He says he can either look at the window, look at the temporal, and interpret everything in the light of the temporal nexus, or he can look into the eternal, look beyond the window. It's like, remember C.S. Lewis's Meditations in a Toolshed. Tell summarize that.
Yeah, well, it's funny, because that Meditations in a Toolshed, that was an experience as a boy I remember well. In fact, because people in Britain had these old garden sheds.
I had the same experience.
They were out and they would have, the gardening tools were there, or maybe the bike or the man's hobby. And of course they were badly made because they were thrown together fairly quickly. And often when you went in, you closed the door, there's a smell of mold and wood. But the sunlight would be coming in. And because of the sunlight, you could see this beam of light, but all filled with particles of dust
floating around. And
so often as a kid, I found myself, I was fascinated by the beam, looking at, gosh, I didn't know all that stuff was in the air. I'm bringing this stuff in. It didn't occur to me at the time.
Of course.
All this kind of, these things. But then Lewis points about that very illustration is that sometimes people look at the beam, but don't look down the beam to where the light's coming from. And I think that from Herbert, that's a beautiful picture that we often see what is before us, but we don't see through the thing to what is.
So there was a similar shed in Monroe where I lived in all my summer youth as my boyhood. So we went down to Monroe from New Jersey, a very different world. Right. But I still remember being in that tool shed. And there it was that gleam. And somehow I was inexorably moved not to look at it, but to look through it. And so there's this magic moment in that split second when suddenly it's no longer a beam in a tool shed.
Yeah, it's a means of seeing.
And you see the sun.
That's it.
You see the sky, you see the leaves and the trees. And suddenly you have an eternal perspective. But it's not you're looking at the thing, you're looking alongside of it. You see, it's an amazingly different, that's what I think Herbert is saying in this whole idea of this perspective, either through the window or at the window.
So we tend then, one of the challenges to living a good Christian life or a serious Christian or just a healthy life is that you don't see well. You don't see things properly. You can't, because the eternal obviously eludes us in a way, and yet there is a way to see the eternal.
There is a way.
In time.
And there's a choice. And a choice is made of who am I going to do this for? Am I doing this playing to an audience of one or to an audience of many? So the third stanza is intriguing because it then moves us to the next step. And here again, Lewis, you're talking about George Herbert, 1593 to 1633, an Elizabethan poet. So you're having to imagine, what would he envision? So he says, all may of thee partake. All may of thee partake. Nothing can be so mean, which I think he means rude, ordinary, dull, uninteresting. Nothing can be so mean that with this tincture, for thy sake, that's the tincture, that's the elixir, will not grow bright and clean.
Well, that's a lovely word.
It's a lovely, this tincture.
Was it tincture? Is that something?
I remember tincture of iodine and all.
You put it to drinks, or you put it to
it was
make
a tincture. Yeah,
you could make
like an oil. It was a thickness.
So a little tincture was added to give it a flavor, or to make a potion, or something.
So with this potion, with this tincture, and here's the blender, the elixir that turns it into from the ordinary to the extraordinary. That's the idea. It's
transformed
for thy sake. That nothing with this tincture, for this sake, will not grow bright and clean. So even if it's construed to be an ordinary routine thing, when you make it for thy sake, that adds the tincture of excellence, of eternity.
That brings, I think you and I talked about this as well. I know we've had so many conversations, but you remember the one we talked about Chesterton and how when in the time he was in this deep soul despair, and he was at the Slade School of Art, and he had basically become a nihilist. He was an anarchist. He was losing it, and he knew he was losing it emotionally, intellectually as well. It was like he's fragmenting on the inside. And he comes along the street, and at that time, there was just they had these beautiful stores, and one of the stores was a toy shop, and it was in those days it was Victorian garments, and one of the things he loved was like carnival things, and there was a carousel.
Yes, a carousel
with horses on it. And it was so intricate and so beautiful. And he was absolutely captured by the sight of this thing. And he realized in that moment that there was order in the universe, if there was nothing else. And he came up with this phrase, he called it the mystical minimum.
It's a good way to put it.
The tincture.
Yes, that's the tincture.
The tincture. Yeah. So the world was charged, in Hopkins' phrase, with the grandeur of God.
The grandeur of God,
and it brought him back to sanity. And it led to him being healed in his soul, and again becoming a great voice for the Christian faith.
So he was tethered to a reality.
He was tethered to something, yes.
So this whole idea, with this tincture for thy sake, that nothing can be so rude, mean, mundane. They cannot be this. And I've often put it this way: the secular becomes spiritual,
becomes a vehicle
when the focus of your heart's the eternal. So what appears to be ordinary, routine, and mundane becomes extraordinary and not mundane but heavenly.
So I'm going to do a little defense view here. So we mentioned this before. Some people sometimes listen to some of the things you're saying, and they kind of use a pejorative as if calling you a mystic. But that's not mysticism. What you're talking about is seeing the grandeur of God, seeing the eternal not demeaning either, not elevating as if it's a pantheistic love of nature or love of a thing, but rather because it's a created thing by the hand of the living God, because it's sanctioned by his word, it's also a vehicle of connection for beauty, goodness, and truth and purpose.
It's a pointer, and it points beyond itself to
a tincture.
A tincture. It's a tincture. It's an elixir.
I'm going to use that word a lot.
It's some special potion that, as it were, that takes the ordinary and says, no, it was never ordinary when I'm there. Everything matters when I'm there.
Nothing's ordinary.
And so that brings us to the next stanza, which I like as well. So nothing can be so mean. With this tincture for thy sake will not grow bright and clean. Now here's my favorite of the stanzas, this fourth one. And I imagine what Herbert would be thinking of. What would be the most unthankful job, the thankless, overlooked kind of a job in Elizabethan England?
Cleaning out a toilet?
Cleaning out a toilet wouldn't be bad.
Or
cleaning up somebody's soot. And their charcoal, because they use charcoal for both cooking and for heating. So they had to have a charwoman, as they called them, who would come in, probably, I'm guessing, on a weekly basis to at least clean up the fireplace and sweep the floors because of all the soot, because of the charcoal that would be there. Well, you imagine that she comes, they're not going to be welcoming her in. She's actually, she's an annoyance, actually.
Right.
It's a necessary annoyance that you have to put up with this person. A thankless task that no one really notices, no one even appreciates it. So this is what he chooses. He says, let me choose the most ignominious thing. A servant with this clause makes drudgery divine. What clause does he mean? This understanding that the tincture for thy sake turns the ordinary into the extraordinary.
Wow.
Turns the temporal into the eternal. A servant, so he says, a servant with this clause, with that understanding, makes drudgery divine. I love that phrase. He makes drudgery divine.
Isn't that a beautiful, and maybe this is partly what you had in mind, isn't that a segue to the fact that of Philippians 2, that Jesus, I mean, again, if we don't value servants, they're invisible. Just like often people in restaurants never see the people serving them or treat them with disrespect. They're invisible. They're just a means to get my food and get
their utility.
But that Jesus, the infinite God, became flesh, dwelt amongst us, but did so by choice, becoming a servant and being willing to die. So taking the very ordinary, the lowly, the least, and using that as a vehicle of transcendence, of eternity in time.
Yes, downward mobility.
Showing up in that way.
Yeah, and coming as a servant, and then also noticing and serving people who are in need, whose presence even would be an embarrassment, where people would want to go the other side of the street.
Right.
He's got this leopard, this blind man, or whatever, and he then stops and reduces his. So the servant of the servants. It's an amazing thought, and so. This concept then redeems and recharges, reframes everything about this. A servant with this clause makes drudgery divine. And then here's the phrase, who sweeps a room as for thy laws, makes that and the action fine. Now that's where the sweeping of the room, the charwoman. What do you think he means? Who sweeps a room as for thy laws, makes that and the action fine.
I think that means turning the drudgery, I think the meaninglessness, the emptiness, maybe the ugliness of an experience into something purpose charged. So that, I mean, isn't that Brother Lawrence?
Yeah.
Isn't that the idea?
That's exactly
that we're doing, we can wash dishes, we can serve people, we can fix cars, we can program computers, we can do all kinds of things to the glory of God if we see him in it.
And
so rather than me waiting for the perfect job, the perfect place where I will now be happy, I could be happy anywhere if I see God in it.
That's precisely the case. That's the tincture, the elixir. That's the glue that holds things together, where the splendor in the ordinary.
Wow.
And where he puts all things together. So this idea, who sweeps a room as for thy laws, that is to say, again, for thy sake.
Before the audience of one.
Before the audience of one.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, makes that and the action fine. And I was chewing on that. What does he mean, the difference between that? And then he says, and the action. So it seems to me that he's saying that he's dignifying that position of a charwoman to being like that of an ambassador to France, because it's elevated to the glory of God. And then if that's true, if that becomes fine, the action, the way in which it's done, is done with excellence and skill, even though no one may notice. God will notice.
It's such an antidote, Ken, to the kind of what I would say the atheist, hard rationalist view of life, in which, I mean, listening to everything we'd say would seem simply absurd, or psychologized babble to some people, or basically, a wish fulfillment. You're projecting a romantic vision of the universe. But if this is truth, if this is reality, then it actually covers all of life with that possibility of seeing the eternal, touching time, and cultivating the eyes to see and the heart to receive and a will to respond.
Yes.
I mean, that means that spirituality is really not an optional extra. It becomes a very important journey. This is not just a psychologized escape mechanism.
No.
It's actually a question, is this real?
It's a rich truth. If Jesus is indeed who he claimed to be, everything changes. All the rules change. Again, suddenly then, what do I seek should be him. Who do you say I am? It's about him. Do you love me more than these? It's about him. It's about a person. Can I love and serve this person through my work. As I do it to delight him, therefore I will do it with a greater excellence than if I were seeking to impress people. Because as I say, you can't seek to be pleasing to Jesus and impressive to people at the same time. You have to choose your audience.
You know, a lot of this, as we are looking about the year and about events, this can't help but draw us towards the incarnation, because I think, you know, in one sense, what Herbert is saying in the poem, and in the eternal in time, surely that is the greatest answer of that, is answered by the incarnation, and Christ coming amongst us is the greatest demonstration that God, that the material, the physical reality is not a problem to be solved, but it's a place to be redeemed, to be restored, to be renewed, and that all of life can be charged with the grandeur of God. It can be healed. We can be forgiven. We can be restored. We can be elevated.
Heaven reaches down to earth so that earth can be elevated up to heaven. He became the Son of Man so that we could be sons of God. He's always the initiator of the pursuit. So then my work is given dignity, because whether others notice or not, I'll do it better than if I'm trying to impress people. So it gives it a glory and an integrity. And so that's a magic that produces. In fact, here's the fifth of these stanzas. He says, this is the famous stone. He's talking about the philosopher's stone, the alchemist, who wants to transmute lead to gold, as you know. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold. For that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. So he's saying this is the alchemy of grace that transmutes the lead of the ordinary into the gold of the extraordinary.
So that the theme of eternity and time, of spirit and matter. There's a lot of there's a lot of these sort of seeming dichotomies that rather resolve them by falling off one side or the other. It's the fusion of them.
It's the fusion
and it's the beauty of God in the present, of eternity overseeing time, as time both began and will run out.
It's a wonderful, rich image, and it's reminding me of another. I won't go into it, but Man's Medley, and Herbert is talking about how we are in fact amphibious beings with one foot in heaven and the other on earth, and so that we have this understanding that we are here, but this isn't our home. We know that there's something of us that is already, according to Colossians 3, since you are now raised with him in the heavenly places.
You're already connected.
You're already connected. You're already there. So how is it possible for me to be a spiritual being having this earthbound embodied experience? So this transcends the atheism of materialism. It's not a big enough nexus. It's not a big enough causal construct to account for these things. The impersonal cannot produce the personal. The chaos cannot produce order. So at the end of the day, we have a logical system, but more than logic. It's a person who spoke beauty, goodness, and truth into being and says life's about him. And once I discover that, then suddenly my life is hidden in Christ, who is my life, so that now it's hidden. And then when he's revealed, then we'll be revealed. But and right now we live a hidden life.
The daily practice is to set your mind on things above,
daily
not
practice,
on things.
Choosing.
So there's a way to experience this. There's a day to stay connected to it until it's completed.
That's correct.
Until we go home.
So we are in this pilgrimage, this journey, but we are heading somewhere. It's not just going in circles. We're heading to home, but at the same time, every day matters, and every person matters, and every situation matters. And though it will go contrary to my desires, because I'm not in control of anything, I can release it to him.
Because there is a purpose, and there's a person.
There's a purpose and a person.
Wow.
And all of that drives me, and he says, it's going to be heavenly, the heavenly home, so that you're joyously giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. Isn't that a lovely way of, wouldn't that be a good thing for us to make as a coda in our days throughout today? Right now, I joyously give thanks to the Father because you've qualified me to be an inheritor of the saints in life that are in here. It's an incredible
As we're looking ahead, I'm thinking in one of our talks, we need to do a little exploration of the angel and the voyager, because I think
like that.
Some of that work that's coming out speaks to the same issue.
It does indeed. It does.
Ken, this is rich, and I think this is what we need to try and get this balance more and help some of our friends and those who are seeking to get this balance of time and eternity. in the right proportion that eternity rules time.
Eternity rules time, and therefore what I do in this moment matters forever.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, great conversation, and look forward to going further up and further in.
Further up and further in. Lovely way of ending the Narniad. Yeah.
God bless
God bless you.
Thank you.